Have you ever wondered what would happen if Gojo Satoru was the villain of Jujutsu Kaisen and Sukuna was the hero? The fundamental truth of the series flipped completely. Gojo, the man who spent the entire story smiling behind a blindfold and protecting children, becomes the most dangerous threat in the world. And Sukuna, the king of curses who massacred Shibuya without blinking, becomes the one holding the line against something worse. Today we break down exactly what that world looks like, and by the end you're going to feel genuinely uncomfortable about which side you would have chosen. Before we get into it, we need to understand why the reversal is even possible. Because the seed of an evil Gojo and a good Sukuna exists inside the canon. In canon, Gojo became the person he is because of one specific sequence, the hidden inventory arc, the mission to protect Riko Amanai, the defeat at Toji's hands, the awakening of reverse curse technique, and critically, the presence of Suguru Geto at every step. Geto was Gojo's moral compass, the person who asked the defining question, are you the strongest because you're Gojo Satoru? Or are you Gojo Satoru because you're the strongest? When Gojo, freshly awakened and drunk on power, offered to massacre the non-sorcerer followers of the Time Vessel Association, Geto said no. That no kept Gojo from crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Now, remove Geto. What if he'd been born 5 years later? What if Gojo went through hidden inventory alone? Without the one person whose grief after Riko's death showed him what it meant to mourn for a human being. Without the one person who said no. Without the mirror that showed Gojo what he looked like when the power started making decisions for him. You get a 16-year-old boy who just survived death, awakened unmatched power, watched a child get shot while non-sorcerers celebrated, and has nobody to tell him that rage is not the same as a reason. He kills the Time Vessel Association, not because he was ordered to, because he felt like it, because the calculation is simple, they are weak, they are cruel, and he is the strongest thing in the world. The logic is clean and terrible, and there is nobody present to introduce the complication it needs. In one night, Gojo crosses a line that Jito's presence prevented him from approaching in canon. That single massacre is the crack in the foundation, and cracks are where everything after grows from, because Gojo is a genius, and geniuses who cross moral lines don't typically stop at one. They find reasons, they construct elaborate justifications that are airtight if you accept the first premise, and the first premise was a massacre of celebrating civilians that nobody was able to stop or punish. What makes this different from Jito's fall in canon? Jito's fall was grief and exhaustion. A good man ground down by a system that took everything and gave nothing back. Gojo's fall is a teenager discovering that being the strongest means rules don't apply to him. It's not grief, it's liberation. And liberation is a much more stable foundation for sustained malevolence than grief, because grief eventually exhausts itself. Liberation never does. He goes back to Jujutsu High, brilliant, untouchable. The higher-ups watch him with the anxiety of people sitting next to a problem they created and can't solve. At 17, a conservative higher-up assigns him a mission beneath his time. Gojo shows up at the committee meeting, sits at the head of the table uninvited, and explains that his participation will be proportional to the institution's usefulness to him. Nobody challenges him, and the fact that nobody can is the second confirmation that rules, for Gojo Satoru, are optional. He doesn't become overtly evil immediately. He starts optimizing, redirecting resources toward goals he finds interesting, creating more sorcerers, not out of care, but because more sorcerers means more complexity. A world worth his attention. He doesn't want anyone to reach him. He wants them to almost reach him and understand the gap. The gap is the point. The gap is what makes existing in this world feel like something. Yuta enters his orbit. Gojo protects him from execution. Not for Yuta's life, but because Rika attached to a teenager is the most interesting technique configuration he's seen in years. Yuta trusts Gojo completely, worships him in the way that lost people worship the first person who made them feel safe. This is the tragedy at the center of this scenario. The trust is genuine, and the trustee is not trustworthy, and Yuta won't understand that until the understanding costs him something. Good Suguru Jito, who never defected in this timeline, because the specific pressure that broke him in canon doesn't exist without Gojo creating the conditions, becomes Yuta's actual teacher in the practical sense. He's the one who sits with Yuta through the difficult early months, who explains cursed energy in a way that connects to how Yuta already thinks about it. And without realizing it at first, Jito becomes the first person to clearly see what Gojo is becoming. Not because Gojo shows him, because Jito knew him before the crack. And knowing someone before the crack means you can see exactly which shape the crack took. Now let's talk about Sukuna. Sukuna Good is not Sukuna Soft. He's 1,000 years old, ate his twin in the womb because their mother was starving, was born with 4 arms and 4 eyes, and was treated as a monster from birth. The Heian era didn't produce gentle things, but in his final conversation with Mahito in canon, Sukuna said that if he was to be reincarnated, he'd like to live differently. The smallest concession to a different existence, a crack in the other direction. In this timeline, that concession becomes the foundation. The difference is a single relationship in Sukuna's first life, not a great love story, not a mentor or a student, just one person who treated him like a person, not a monster to be feared, not a power to be used, someone who argued with Sukuna constantly and never once ran away, because running away would have meant accepting the frame that Sukuna was something to run from. Sukuna didn't save that person. The Heian era was brutal, and people died regardless of how powerful their companions were. But the experience of having had that one relationship changed the baseline. The specific mechanism of cruelty that drove him in canon, the contempt for all connection, the pleasure in suffering, the philosophical conviction that love was a weakness worth eliminating, that mechanism has a hairline fracture in it, not enough to make him kind, enough to make him capable of recognizing recognizing something in other people that isn't just a target, he is still terrifying, still the strongest sorcerer of his era by an absurd margin. Still not a being you approach without a serious risk assessment, but the complete absence of anything resembling restraint has been replaced by something quieter. The understanding that there was, once, a reason not to destroy everything, and reasons, even old ones, have weight. When Kenjaku's deal comes through Yorame, Sukuna accepts reincarnation. He arrives inside Yuji, and the first thing he registers is the soul. Massive. Not in power terms, Yuji's curse energy is significant but not special at this stage. In presence, the soul of Yuji Itadori is enormous in the way that certain landscapes are enormous. Not because they're tall, but because there's nothing blocking the view in any direction. And underneath the chaos of the encounter, the swallowed finger, the awakening, the institutional response, Sukuna reads the architecture and recognizes something he hasn't felt since the Heian era. Sincerity. Total, unreserved sincerity. The boy wants to protect people, not as a goal he's working toward, not as an identity he's constructed, as a biological function, like breathing, like the way Sukuna himself was constitutionally unable to stop fighting. Yuji is constitutionally unable to stop caring. Sukuna's default response would normally be contempt, but the hairline fracture means something more complicated comes out. He watches. He processes the modern world through Yuji's sensory experience. The noise and speed and strange softness of a world that has had centuries to build things Sukuna's era didn't have words for. And then, Yuji meets Gojo. Sukuna watches through Yuji's eyes, and every alarm he possesses rings simultaneously. He has 1,000 years of pattern recognition, and what he reads in Gojo's cursed energy signature, the quality of it, the specific way it moves when Gojo is performing warmth rather than feeling it, is something he's seen before. The signature of someone who has decided that rules were designed for smaller people. Sukuna knows that signature because he wrote it. He is that signature in most timelines. Seeing it in someone else, in someone who has already convinced an entire institution to love and depend on him, produces something Sukuna hasn't felt in a long time. Alarm! He tells Yuji, not gently, because Sukuna has never been gentle and doesn't intend to start now. Be careful with that one! Yuji, who has never heard Sukuna sound anything but contemptuous or threatening, hears something different this time. The specific weight of someone who recognizes a pattern and knows its ending. Gojo takes Yuji in as a student. He teaches him, pushes him, makes him faster, stronger, more capable with every session, and the teaching is real. Gojo is genuinely skilled at it because developing others requires a form of intelligence he possesses completely. But Sukuna watches from inside and understands what this is. Not care. Investment. The difference between a teacher who wants their student to surpass them and a collector who wants their acquisition to appreciate and value. The warmth of genuine care and the warmth of strategic interest feel identical until the moment the strategy requires the warmth to end. Jito figures it out first, the way people who knew someone before the crack always figure it out first. He's been watching Gojo for years, maintaining a friendship across a distance that has slowly become too wide to cross comfortably. What he sees in how Gojo engages with Yuji, the specific quality of attention, the way the warmth is always precisely calibrated, never excessive and never deficient, is familiar in the worst way. Gito goes to Yuji, not to warn him directly, because direct warnings about Gojo Satoru from anyone tend to be dismissed by people who have experienced his protection. Instead, he teaches him the real history of Jujutsu society, the massacres, the cover-ups, the political maneuvering that has kept the wrong people in power for generations, the pattern of how power concentrations, left unchecked, tend to resolve themselves at the expense of everyone nearby. Sukuna listens to every lesson and volunteers information for the first time since reincarnation, because the information serves his alarm, and his alarm is now the most important thing he's running, the one teaching you now. He believes what he's saying. How can you tell? Because the ones who don't believe it teach it the same way every time. He's different every session because the meaning keeps changing for him. That's what belief looks like. It moves. A pause. Belief in the wrong thing is more dangerous than cynicism. Cynicism is at least honest about itself. The goodwill event arrives. In this timeline, the assassination order comes from Gojo himself, not because he wants Yuji dead for personal reasons. Yuji is still interesting to him, still a worthwhile investment, but Sukuna at full power is the one variable he cannot account for, and variables that can't be accounted for need to be eliminated before they become problems. He doesn't issue the order directly. He restructures the Kyoto mission briefing to make containment sound like standard protocol. Widers, the thing he wants, wrapped in the language of institutional responsibility. It's elegant. It's the kind of manipulation that only works when everyone in the room already trusts you enough to fill the gaps themselves. Jito discovers the restructured briefing 12 hours before the event. He sits with it for an hour, then he goes to Gojo directly, because Jito is the only person alive who will say it to Gojo's face, and saying it to his face is the only version that means anything. You're wrong. You're wrong, and you know you're wrong, and the fact that nobody can stop you doesn't make you right. Gojo listens, doesn't deny, doesn't deflect. Something in his face shifts. Not quite guilt, but the recognition of guilt, the ghost of it, the memory of what guilt felt like before it became inconvenient. You're the most interesting person I know, Shuguru. That quality in you, that's exactly why I'm glad you're here. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have. And for a fraction of a second, something genuinely sad crosses his face. The ghost of the person he would have been if someone had said no at the right moment 17 years ago. The person Jito would have produced. If he'd been there, then it's gone. Filed. The distance Gojo maintains from his own grief is the most sophisticated technique he's ever developed. The assassination fails because Jito pulls the Kyoto students aside and tells them what the brief briefing actually asked them to do. Not all of them listen, but enough do. Maki refuses immediately. She's spent her life identifying the people who use institutional language to cover personal agendas, and she's very good at it. Panda refuses. Inumaki refuses. And Toto walks directly up to Yuji, claps his shoulder with the force of someone who has decided a decision, and says, "What kind of woman is your type?" Which is Toto's way of saying, "I'm with you," which is all it ever means. Meanwhile, Sukuna tells Yuji everything. What he read in Gojo's soul. What the order meant. What the warmth has been covering all this time. He delivers this information with the precise detachment of a military briefing, which is somehow worse than if he'd been emotional about it. Facts delivered without affect, about someone Yuji trusted completely. The specific cruelty of accurate information. Yuji is quiet for a very long time. Then, what do? We stop him. How? I don't know yet, but I know what he's building toward. You stop it early, or you deal with the consequences for generations. A pause. I know that because I was the consequence once. For generations. Shibuya arrives with entirely different architecture. Kenjaku has been working with Gojo, not against him. Two monsters whose blueprints overlap sufficiently to produce cooperation. Kenjaku's merger creates a world of evolved humans with cursed energy baseline, which serves Gojo's goal of a world where power determines everything and he is the most powerful thing. They cooperate without trusting each other, which is the most stable form of collaboration between entities at their level. The veil descends, but the trap isn't designed to seal Gojo. It's designed to seal Sukuna, identified correctly as the primary obstacle. The prison realm is deployed on Yuji. Jito throws himself in front of it, not because he calculated the odds, not because he had a plan, because Yuji is behind him and the prison realm is in front of him. And Jito Suguru has spent his entire adult life being the person who stands between things he loves and things that want to consume them. The prison realm takes Jito instead, gone in the same instant he was trying to prevent. The cruelest possible outcome. The intervention works, and the cost is total. Yuji screams, and Sukuna does something he hasn't done in 1,000 years. He takes over, not to fight, not to demonstrate power, to hold, to be the structural support that Yuji's architecture needs when it's collapsing under a weight it was never designed to carry along. He knew. He chose it. That's not nothing. It's everything. I know. 3 seconds in the middle of Shibuya. The curse and the vessel sharing a grief neither expected and neither is equipped for. Then Sukuna gives the body back and says, "Now we end it. Not with appetite. With the specific determination of someone who has decided that this particular wrong needs to be made right," which is the rarest thing Sukuna has ever felt. The coalition that forms is the strangest alliance in Jujutsu history. Yuji carrying Sukuna's knowledge and his grief and his growing understanding that the person inside him has chosen a side. Megumi running on pure stubborn refusal. The specific stubbornness of someone who made peace with the darkness of the world a long time ago and refuses to let the world add any more. Nobara, who never needed the institutional framing to identify the bad guy, she looked at the situation and named it in under 30 seconds. Yuta, the hardest conversion, the most painful one, requiring him to rebuild everything he understood about who protected him and why. And Toto, who never needed any of it explained because he looked at the situation and said, "Gojo's got no passion. Look at his eyes. He's not fighting for anything real. He's just collecting." And collectors always eventually run out of things worth collecting. Sukuna fights Gojo directly, not with raw power. That battle he loses because Gojo's technical ceiling is too high and Sukuna and Yuji's body doesn't have full high-end output. Hey, he fights with 1,000 years of experience against someone who has never faced an opponent who truly understood what they were, who saw the crack not as a weakness, but as a shape, the exact shape of the absence that produced everything after. He finds it in the domain clash. Malevolent Shrine restructured to target specific cursed energy signatures rather than everything in range, covering more area at lower individual cost. He finds the fracture point, the grief at the center, the 16-year-old boy standing in front of celebrating civilians with power that nobody can answer and nobody to tell him what to do with the rage. The specific shape of what Gojo would have been if someone had been there. He doesn't exploit it. He touches it carefully with the precision of someone who has spent 1,000 years understanding that the difference between breaking a thing and reaching into it is entirely in the intent. You wanted someone to stop you. Back then, you wanted someone to say no. Unlimited void flickers. For the first time in Gojo's adult life, his technique wavers because something reached the thing underneath it. Nobody did, Gojo says, and for the first time, his voice is not composed, not performed, not precisely calibrated, just the voice of someone who has been carrying something for 17 years without being able to put it down. Somewhat did, Sukuna says. Today, the combination that finishes Gojo is Yuji's, the sole perception Sukuna taught him across weeks of shared mental space, refined through every mission and every argument and every moment where Sukuna chose to teach rather than to simply endure. Yuji finds the same fracture and does what Yuji always does. He doesn't exploit it. He reaches through it. Hey, he makes contact with the thing inside Gojo that has been screaming since a 16-year-old boy stood in front of celebrating non-sorcerers and nobody said stop. Gojo stops. Not because he's defeated in the conventional sense, not because his technique has been overcome, because for the first time since Hidden Inventory, someone reached the part of him the crack couldn't touch. The part that's been sealed behind 17 years of optimizing and collecting and building frameworks and performing warmth, the part that still remembers what it felt like to be afraid before he became the thing that was feared. He closes his eyes. His cursed energy drops in stages like something being carefully set down rather than knocked over. His technique deactivates. Unlimited void dissolves. Most powerful sorcerer alive stands in the rubble of Shibuya and does not fight. And Yuji, through tears he doesn't bother hiding because hiding them would be dishonest. And dishonesty is not something Yuji Itadori is capable of, says, "I've got you." In canon, those words belong to Yuji receiving protection, being caught when he falls. In this timeline, they belong to Yuji offering it to the strongest sorcerer in history, who built an entire philosophy around never needing to be caught, who created the performance of invulnerability so thoroughly that he almost forgot it was a performance. The world rebuilds. Kenjaku, without his most powerful cooperating force, is isolated and eventually sealed. The higher-ups who built their authority on Gojo's cooperation discover that authority without backing has no structural integrity. It collapses the moment you push on it. The next generation inherits a world turned inside out and has to decide what to build from the pieces, which turns out to be exactly the kind of problem they were trained for, even if the training came wrapped in other lessons. Sukuna, still inside Yuji, is oddly quiet during reconstruction, watching people build things, not with contempt. The contempt would have been present in the other timeline's version of this moment, with the expression of someone who has seen enough things built and destroyed to understand that the building is the point, not the structure that stands. The act of construction, choosing to make something where there was nothing. The refusal to accept that entropy is the only available direction. "What are you thinking?" Yuji asked one afternoon. "The sun is doing something specific to the Shinjuku reconstruction site, and the light is making everything look more intact than it is. That I was wrong 1,000 years ago. I thought the only honest thing was to stop pretending it could be different. That connection was a lie people told themselves to make the waiting bearable." Yuji waits. Waiken. He's learned over months of shared existence that Sukuna's meaningful statements come in two parts, and the second part requires patience. It can be different, marginally, impermanently, with enormous effort and a high probability of failure, but it can be different. Is that enough? A silence that has 1,000 years of history compressed into it. Then, ask me in another 1,000 years. Yuji smiles. It's the smile that reaches his eyes, the one that used to define him before everything got complicated and now, slowly, is coming back. Deal. And inside him, something ancient and terrible and improbably, stubbornly alive, chooses not to argue. That's what would happen if Gojo was the villain and Sukuna was the hero. Do you think Gojo's fall was always possible? Or does the canon version exist because Jito specifically prevented it at every turn? Drop your answer in the comments. And if you want to see more What If videos, like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching!